Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So for this video, I'm going to talk about what has happened in St. Louis. You have another situation of police brutality, another situation where a cop kills a black man and there's no justice. This cop was found not guilty, and as a result, people have been protesting in St. Louis. There have been reports of some property damage, businesses being targeted by protesters, but most of the protesters were peaceful according to the news reports. So I want to talk about this situation. And I know that the mainstream media has moved on. They're no longer focusing on this issue, but I'm going to stay on point. I'm going to focus on this issue because it's very important. It's another example of police brutality. It's another example of police being able to kill black people with impunity. Another example of black people being denied justice. So here you have this white police officer named Jason Stockley. He observes what he believes to be a drug transaction, some drug activity, some illegal activity. And this is what he observes. They observe Mr. Smith going in and out of a restaurant without purchasing any food, and they assume that he's up to no good. They assume that he's participating in some kind of drug transaction. So the police try to arrest him. So they block his vehicle in, and they get out of the car, and they're trying to arrest him. Somehow, Anthony Smith manages to get out of that parking spot. He manages to drive out of that parking spot and flee the police in his vehicle. The police proceed to chase him in their vehicle, and the police eventually stop him. But before they stop him, this officer named Jason Stockley is recorded on the tape within the police car saying this. He's saying, "We're going to kill this motherfucker, don't you know?" This is what he's saying while he's in this police car pursuing Anthony Smith. And then once he stops Anthony Smith, once he's able to get out of the car and confront Anthony Smith, that's exactly what he does. He proceeds to kill this brother. Now, according to Jason Stockley, he says that he told Mr. Smith to raise his hands, to put his hands up or something to that effect. But he says that Mr. Smith was reaching around in the vehicle and that Mr. Smith reached for a gun. And at that point, he feared for his safety. So he proceeded to shoot and kill his brother, shooting him multiple times, shooting him in the neck, shooting him in the left chest, shooting him in the left flank, shooting him in the lower left flank, shooting him in his left forearm, killing his brother. And he claims that he feared for his safety. He claims that the brother was reaching for a gun between the seats or whatever. And after he shoots this brother, and at the time when he shoots this brother, he has on gloves. He goes back to his police vehicle. He goes inside of the police vehicle and he digs around and he finds something, and then he returns to Mr. Smith's vehicle. But before he returns to Mr. Smith's vehicle, he takes off his gloves. So he no longer has gloves on. He goes into the car, and then later on, he recovers a gun. Now, in 2016, the prosecutor finally brought charges against this officer, accusing him of planting a gun, accusing him of murder. And the case goes to trial, and a couple of weeks ago, the judge decided that Jason Stockley was not guilty of murder. He decided that the police officer wasn't even guilty of lesser homicides. So this officer walks completely free. Now, the thing that makes this whole situation odd, he claims that he was saying, that put your hands up and all that kind of stuff, or keep your hands up. And he says that he feared that Mr. Smith was reaching for a gun. He says that his partner told him that Mr. Smith had a gun. But while his partner told him this, His partner kept his own gun in his holster. So you would think that if someone feared that another person had a gun, they feared that this person was possibly going to shoot somebody, you would think that that officer would have his gun out of his holster. So that's one thing that's suspicious. Another thing is this. When they tested the gun for DNA, they didn't find Mr. Smith's DNA on it. They only found Mr. Stockley's DNA on it. And according to this, according to Mr. Stockley's story, one would think that his first contact with this gun was when he found it within Mr. Smith's car. You would think that. So his first contact with this gun, his DNA is on the gun. But they want us to believe that this is Mr. Smith's gun, but there is no DNA from Mr. Smith on the gun, even though it's his gun. He's been in possession of it for quite some time, according to their story, but none of his DNA is found on it. And then you had a situation where this officer doesn't have on gloves at the time when he conducts this search. According to this black police officers organization, that is against protocols in the police department. They're supposed to have on gloves when they conduct searches, but he didn't have on gloves at this time. The fact that he talks about, killing somebody before he actually does, that makes it clear that he had some kind of deliberation, that he was thinking about it, that he actually wanted to kill this man, Mr. Smith. But they want us to believe that he was just speaking out of emotion. They want us to believe that he didn't remember what he said. That's what he said. Later on, he did an interview and he said that he didn't remember saying those words. He said that he didn't have any intent to kill Mr. Smith when he stopped him. But why would he say, we're going to kill this motherfucker, if he didn't mean it? Why would he say that if that was not his intention? If that was not what he was actually thinking at the time? So he killed this brother. He killed him, and this judge, I read the decision. It's about 30 pages long. And when you read this decision, all you see this judge doing is searching for some kind of reasonable doubt, like going out of his way to find some kind of rationale for everything that doesn't make sense in this case, trying to reason and come up with something that would live up to the standard of reasonable doubt. It's like he was deliberately looking for some reason to find this cop not guilty. And that's what he did. And that's what the system does. When these police kill black people, these juries often find reasons to find that police officer not guilty. Judges find reasons to find the officer not guilty because that's the nature of this system. They value white lives. They value police officers, but they don't value black lives. Black lives mean absolutely nothing to these people. They mean nothing to these people. They don't care anything about black lives. Black lives mean nothing. Black people can be killed, and these people will come up with all kinds of reasons to justify the killing of black people. Just like this cop, he went through everything, every argument that the state brought in the case and came up with some kind of reason to try to explain it away. This shooting took place within 15 seconds. Within 15 seconds of that police officer being in front of Mr. Smith's vehicle, stopping Mr. Smith, he proceeds to kill his brother, shooting him multiple times. It just doesn't add up, man. The judge tried to explain away all those points. The point about the gloves, the point about his partner not pulling out his gun, even though he's saying that Mr. Smith has a gun. The whole thing about this gun possibly being planted. Why did he go back to the police car and then go back to Mr. Smith's car? What was he doing? He wants us to believe that he had some kind of bandage or something to that effect to stop the bleeding. That's what he went to the car for. But we know the history in St. Louis. I was watching a video this morning about a St. Louis officer talking about planting guns on people. I will post a link to that story in the description box so that you can watch it for yourself. I'll post links to the court's decision so that you can read it for yourself. I'll post the video to Officer Jason Stockley's interview so you can watch it for yourself. They want to explain away all this, explain away his statements, explain away the peculiar nature in which this gun was found. You know, you had this judge say that in his history of being a judge for 30-something years, most drug dealers have guns. You know, most drug dealers have guns on them and stuff like that. He used that as a reason to say, well, there was definitely some kind of gun here. There's a reasonable argument that there was a gun, that it was Mr. Smith's gun, despite the odd circumstances. I mean, you would think that if Mr. Smith owned that gun and handled that gun over an extended period of time, you would think that his DNA would be somewhere on that gun. You would think that. But yet you had this situation where this cop handles the gun for the first time in his life, and all of a sudden his DNA is all over the gun. Why isn't Mr. Smith's DNA on the gun? And the court tried to explain it away to say that it's rare the DNA is on a gun and all that kind of stuff. So why is Mr. Stockley's DNA on that gun? Explain that to us. It's just a shame, man. It's just a shame that under these circumstances, you would have a court actually find this man not guilty. And when I watched the interview, his body language made it clear to me that he was lying. You know, the way he blinked his eyes and stuff in response to the questions that he was asked. His answers made no sense. And, you know, this whole case, you know, it raises several questions. I mean, one question that I have is like, why did it take them so long to charge this officer with this crime? I mean, this happened in 2011 and they charged him in 2016. Another question that I have is like, why was there so little coverage? The only way I heard about this case ahead of time was in black news sources, like The Root. I think it was The Root and the Griot. They were talking about possible unrest occurring in St. Louis depending on how the court decides in this case. So I had some indication that this would come up, or, you know, some information about the case, but I didn't have much about it. Didn't have much information about it. You know, I didn't hear about it on like CNN before the unrest. I didn't hear about it on the Today Show or any other news source before the unrest. So this whole thing just makes me wonder, like, how can we really deal with this situation of police brutality? I mean, you have a criminal justice system that doesn't give a damn about black people, that allows these police to kill black people time and time again, whether we're talking about Eric Garner, whether we're talking about Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown, or all the countless black people who have been killed by these police, and there are either no charges or you know, there are charges and the officer is exonerated. And this doesn't just apply to situations involving police. It can involve situations of wannabe police, like these neighborhood watch people or white vigilantes or just racist white people. They give these people the benefit of the doubt too often, and there is no justice. And after a certain point, you know, the people are going to lose complete faith in the system, and they're going to participate in rebellions. They're going to participate in riots. And I've talked about this. I said it's just a matter of time before the next incident. And we saw that after this verdict, you saw damage to property, you saw windows smashed and all that kind of stuff. You saw nonviolent protests, you saw acts of civil disobedience, and that's what needs to happen. That kind of act, in terms of the civil disobedience, in terms of action and protest, that's what needs to happen. because apparently the system is not listening to the people. Apparently the system is not giving a damn about black people. And often it's unrest that brings about some kind of results. It was unrest in Baltimore City that brought about a Department of Justice investigation. If the people just sat back and said, oh, well, it's just another black man killed, it's business as usual, let's continue with things as they always occur without voicing our concerns, without raising our voices, without protesting or rioting. If we just sat back and did nothing, nothing would happen. But because the people rose up here in Baltimore and in Ferguson and other places, all of a sudden the Department of Justice had to do an investigation. And they uncovered what we already knew. They uncovered patterns of police brutality in these places, patterns of racial profiling in these places. And because of that, under the Obama administration, consent decrees were reached in various places to change discriminatory practices, to eliminate discriminatory practices. So that's why the people need to keep protesting. They need to keep up the pressure to make a difference. To make a difference, to force an investigation, to force police reforms. Because something has to be done. When the people have no faith in the system, when the people cannot rely on police to protect and serve, you have a situation of chaos. You have a situation where the people are going to rise up against the system. And that's what they're going to do. That's what they are doing in St. Louis. And I hope they continue to protest, because often the press just goes with what's hot for the moment, and they could care less a few days later. They could care less about the police brutality going on in places like St. Louis after the protests have died down and after the people have become silent. It's like a cycle that goes on where you have a black man or black woman killed by these police. You have hashtags on Twitter. You have protests and all that kind of stuff. And then, often what happens is there is no justice. The police officer walks away and the family is left with their pain and with no accountability for these police. Then after that, you have protests, you have riots, and then they throw you a few crumbs to satisfy you and pacify you and calm you down. They get you some Negro pastors to preach to you about forgiveness and love and all that kind of stuff, teach you about hope and, maintaining faith in the system. And then you lulled back to sleep. You go back to sleep. And then the same cycle repeats itself where there's another black victim. Meanwhile, this system of racism, this system of police brutality, this system that doesn't give a damn about black lives, this system that devours black lives continues on killing black people and not rendering justice. And we have to do something to change this situation. One thing that the court talked about in this decision, they said, well, that gun is too big to conceal. It would have been, there would have been some kind of bulge or this and that. I mean, these police officers conceal weapons all the time. As I said before, there are reports of police planting weapons. That's not just something that happens in St. Louis. That's something that happens all around the country, where these police will set a black man up by planting guns on them, planting drugs on them. We saw what happened in Baltimore. These police officers were captured on videotape planting drugs on people. These police are not to be trusted. I don't give them the benefit of the doubt. And this judge talked about how there were other officers in the area and they didn't observe any, gun being planted and this and that. There's a code of silence among these police. These police protect their own, and they have a wall between them and the people. So they will cover up for each other. They will make excuses for each other. They will vouch for each other even when they're wrong as hell. So I wouldn't be surprised if they even observed this and did nothing. So it's like, it's time for us to take action, man. These protests have to continue, man. We need to fight for changes within these police systems. We need to fight against police brutality. Now is not the time for silence. And it's just a shame that you had this occur. And from what I understand, this officer served in the military. And I think that a lot of these people in the military, they suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Instead of patrolling the streets like an officer who is concerned about the community, protecting the community, they patrol the community like a military force, like the Black Panthers talked about, like an occupying army. And they treat the people like they are in Baghdad or something, like they're occupying Baghdad, where they kill people with impunity. They kill people without regard for human life, without any kind of concern or compassion. And that's probably what happened here. So it's just a very tragic situation. I mean, it's like, how long will this stuff continue, man? How long will these police continue to kill us and we sit back and allow it to happen, man? It's like gotten so bad that we have become accustomed to this oppression. We have normalized it. We have accepted it as our reality. So nobody's shocked anymore. Nobody's surprised anymore. Nobody's outraged the way they should be. Or very few are outraged. The minute that you get used to these types of conditions, that's the minute you become a full slave.